The repository of forgotten things. The repository of forgotten things perched on the edge of reality itself, a sprawling complex of impossible architecture carved into the heart of Mount Obsidian. From the outside, it appeared as nothing more than a sheer cliff face, black and foreboding, but those who knew the secret paths could find their way into the greatest collection of lost knowledge in the known universe. Elian Frost had not meant to find it. The 12-year-old orphan had simply been running from the local village bullies, scrambling up the forbidden slopes of the mountain despite all warnings, when a sudden storm forced him to seek shelter in what looked like a shallow cave. One misstep on the slippery stone had sent him tumbling through an invisible barrier, depositing him in a vast entrance hall with ceilings that soared impossibly high. "Hello," his voice echoed through the chamber, bouncing off shelves that stretched beyond what his eyes could comprehend. Globes of soft amber light floated overhead, casting gentle illumination across row upon row of ancient tomes, scrolls, and artifacts. No one answered. Elian pushed his dark hair from his eyes and ventured deeper. The air smelled of parchment and something else, something older, like the scent of stars and time itself. His worn boots made no sound on the polished floor as he moved between towering shelves, each housing objects and texts more peculiar than the last. "You shouldn't be here, child." Elian whirled around. Where there had been empty space moments before, a tall figure now stood. She appeared humanoid, but something about her movements suggested otherwise. Her skin held an opalescent quality that shifted subtly under the floating lights, and her hair cascaded like liquid silver down her back. Most striking were her eyes, deep violet with rectangular pupils that contracted slightly as she studied him. "I'm sorry," Elian stuttered. "I didn't mean to trespass. The storm." "No storm has breached these barriers in 7,000 years, the woman said, her voice melodic yet tinged with something ancient. "Which means you found a way through our wards. Fascinating." She circled him slowly, her long robes of midnight blue whispering across the floor. Elian noticed her hands, long-fingered and elegant, but with nails that tapered to subtle points. "I'm Keeper Nyx," she said finally, "and you are an unexpected variable in a very old equation." "I'm Elian Frost. I'm from Riverend Village. I can leave if—" "No," Nyx cut him off. "Now that you've found us, leaving isn't quite so simple." She gestured toward the entrance, which Elian now realized had disappeared entirely. "The repository reveals itself only to those it chooses." Fear gripped Elian's heart. "Am I trapped here?" A hint of amusement crossed Nyx's features. "Not trapped. Selected, perhaps. The question is, why would the repository choose a child?" Before Elian could respond, a tremor ran through the building. Dust sifted down from the distant ceiling, and several books shifted on their shelves. Nyx's expression hardened. "They're searching again," she murmured, more to herself than to Elian, growing bolder with each passing cycle. "Who's searching?" Elian asked. Nyx seemed to remember his presence. "The Voidwalkers, they seek knowledge not meant for mortal minds." She fixed him with those unnerving violet eyes. "Come, if the repository has chosen you, there must be a reason, and we'd best discover it before they sense your presence." She led him deeper into the labyrinthine collection, past shelves containing objects that defied understanding, globes that showed worlds Elian had never seen, instruments that played music when no one touched them, and books whose text shifted and changed as he glanced at them. They arrived at a circular chamber with a domed ceiling painted to resemble a night sky filled with constellations Elian didn't recognize. In the center stood a pedestal upon which rested a single book bound in what appeared to be metallic scales. "This is the registry," Nyx explained. "It records all who are permitted entry to the repository. Place your hand upon it." Hesitantly, Elian reached out and touched the book. The scales felt warm beneath his fingers, almost alive. The book fell open of its own accord, pages flipping rapidly before settling on a blank page. As Elian watched, his name appeared in script that glowed briefly before fading to an ordinary ink. "As I suspected," Nyx murmured, "the repository recognizes you." "But why? I'm nobody special." Nyx tilted her head. "That remains to be seen," she pointed to Elian's chest. "What's that you're wearing?" Elian looked down. Hanging from a leather cord around his neck was a small pendant, a flat disc of unknown metal with strange inscriptions etched into its surface. It had been with him for as long as he could remember, the only possession he had from his unknown parents. I've always had it. The orphanage headmistress said it was around my neck when they found me as a baby. Nix's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Elian thought they flashed gold. "May I?" she asked, reaching for the pendant. When her fingertips touched the metal, the inscriptions glowed with a soft blue light. Nix drew her hand back as if burned, and Elian could have sworn he saw scales ripple briefly across her skin. "Impossible," she whispered, "after all this time." Another tremor, stronger than the first, shook the chamber. Books tumbled from shelves, and one of the floating lights winked out. "They're getting closer," Nix said, suddenly urgent. "They must have sensed the pendant's activation." She grasped Elian's shoulders. "Listen carefully. What you wear around your neck is a key to knowledge that was meant to be forgotten, knowledge that could reshape or destroy worlds." "I don't understand," Elian said, his voice small against the magnitude of her words. "You will," Nix's expression softened slightly. "But first we must ensure your safety. The Voidwalkers would tear you apart to possess what hangs around your neck." She led him through a concealed door behind a tapestry depicting some kind of winged serpent. They traveled down a narrow corridor that seemed to descend deep into the heart of the mountain. The air grew warmer, and Elian noticed an orange glow ahead. The corridor opened into a cavern so vast that Elian couldn't see its boundaries. A lake of what appeared to be molten gold filled much of it, casting everything in warm light. Near the shore, a small area had been furnished with bookshelves, a desk, and what looked like living quarters. "My private study," Nix explained. "No one comes here without my permission." "It's beautiful," Elian breathed, staring at the golden lake. "It's not what you think," Nix said, following his gaze. "But explanations can wait. First, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." She gestured to his pendant. "May I examine it more carefully?" Elian hesitated, then lifted the cord over his head and placed the pendant in Nix's outstretched hand. The inscriptions glowed brighter at her touch. "As I suspected," she murmured. "These markings, they're in the old tongue, the language of Mai," she caught herself. "A very ancient language indeed, one believed lost to time." "Can you read it?" Elian asked. It's been a very long time." Her fingers traced the symbols delicately. "This speaks of the Starfare Codex, a compendium of knowledge so powerful that its creators scattered its pages across the cosmos rather than risk it falling into the wrong hands." "And my pendant?" "A key, a map, perhaps both." Nix returned it to him. "What matters is that the Voidwalkers want it, which means we must protect it, and you." Another tremor, powerful enough to cause ripples across the golden lake. "They're persistent," Nix said grimly. "We don't have much time. Elian, would you be willing to learn something few mortals have ever known?" "Learn what?" "The old tongue, the language inscribed on your pendant. I believe the repository chose you because you have the capacity to understand it." "Me, but I'm terrible at languages. My teachers always said." "Your teachers didn't know what I know." Nix's voice held an edge of something ancient and powerful. "This language is in your blood, Elian Frost. I can sense it. And if we're to protect the Starfare Codex from those who would misuse it, you must learn to read these inscriptions yourself." A final, massive tremor shook the cavern. Dust and small rocks rained from the ceiling, and a distant alarm began to wail. "They've breached the outer wards," Nix said, her voice hardening. "We've run out of time for explanations." She moved with sudden, inhuman speed to a cabinet, retrieving an ancient tome bound in what looked like silver metal. "We begin now, your first lesson in the old tongue." As Nix opened the book, its pages emanated a light that cast strange, shifting shadows across her face. For just a moment, Elian thought he saw something else beneath her humanoid features, something ancient and scaled and infinitely more terrifying. "Read," she commanded, pointing to the first line of symbols that looked eerily similar to those on his pendant. And as Elian stared at the strange markings, something impossible happened. The symbols began to shift and rearrange, as if they were alive, forming patterns that somehow made sense to him despite their alien nature. I think I can read it," he whispered in disbelief. Nix's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Of course you can. The question is, are you ready for what it has to tell you?" Whispers in an ancient tongue. The repository's inner sanctum pulsed with ancient energies as Nix guided Elian through the first phrases of the old tongue. Each syllable seemed to shimmer in the air as he spoke them, leaving traces of luminescence that faded slowly. "Again," Nix instructed, her finger tracing the intricate symbols on the page. "Feel the resonance in your chest before you speak." Elian took a deep breath and tried once more. "Vontor escalith," he pronounced carefully. This time, the pendant at his throat glowed in response, sending a warm vibration through his body. The symbols in the book briefly illuminated, matching the pendant's radiance. "Good," Nix said, satisfaction evident in her voice. "You have a natural affinity that's quite remarkable." "What does it mean?" Elian asked, fascinated by the lingering glow. "Roughly translated, knowledge is fire, wisdom is how not to burn." Nix's eyes narrowed slightly. "A fitting first lesson considering what we face." Above them, the sounds of intrusion continued. Distant booms and the occasional tremor that sent ripples across the Golden Lake's surface. "The Voidwalkers are persistent," Elian observed, glancing nervously at the ceiling. "They've sought the Starfare Codex for millennia," Nix replied, turning another page in the ancient tome. "What's another hour breaking through my defenses?" Despite her casual tone, Elian noticed the tension in her shoulders. Whatever or whoever these Voidwalkers were, they clearly concerned her. "Why do they want this codex so badly?" he asked. Nix closed the book momentarily, considering her answer. "Imagine possessing the knowledge to reshape reality itself, to bend the laws of nature, to create or destroy entire worlds with a word." Her violet eyes fixed on his. "The Starfare Codex contains exactly that, the fundamental equations of creation, written in the old tongue." "That's impossible," Elian whispered. "Is it?" Nix raised an eyebrow. "You've already witnessed how the language responds to you. The symbols glow, the air shifts, energy moves. That's merely a fraction of its potential." She reopened the book. "The codex itself was dismantled eons ago, its pages scattered across the cosmos to prevent misuse. Your pendant is both map and key to one such fragment." Another tremor, stronger than before, shook the chamber. A few books toppled from shelves. "They're getting closer," Elian said, anxiety creeping into his voice. "Then we must work faster," Nix pointed to a new line of text. "This phrase activates protective wards, learn it well." For the next hour, as the sounds of intrusion grew steadily closer, Elian immersed himself in the strange language. To his amazement, the words came more easily with each attempt. It was as if some part of him recognized the patterns, the flow of syllables feeling increasingly natural on his tongue. Whenever he correctly pronounced a phrase, his pendant responded with pulses of light, sometimes projecting faint symbols into the air around them. "How is this possible?" he asked during a brief rest. "I've never been good at languages, but this one, it almost feels like I've known it before." Nix studied him with those unnerving violet eyes. "Tell me, Elian, what do you know of your parents?" "Nothing," he answered with a shrug that didn't quite hide the old pain. "I was left at the orphanage as an infant, just me and this pendant. And no one ever came looking for you." "No, well, except—" Elian frowned, remembering something he hadn't thought about in years. "When I was about 5, the headmistress said some strange people came asking about a child with a metal disc. She told them there was no such child, and they eventually left." Nix's expression darkened. "The Voidwalkers have been seeking you for longer than I realized." She paced along the edge of the Golden Lake, her reflection rippling strangely, sometimes appearing to show a different form entirely. "Elian, there is something you must understand about the old tongue. It isn't merely a language, it's a bloodline." "A bloodline?" "The ability to properly speak it, to activate its power, is hereditary. It cannot be fully mastered by someone without the right ancestry." She turned to face him. Your natural facility with these phrases suggests your lineage traces back to the original keepers of the Starfare Codex. Elian stared at her, trying to process this information. You're saying my parents were descendants of those who created and guarded this knowledge, yes. Nyx returned to his side. Which makes you exceptionally valuable to the Voidwalkers and exceptionally dangerous to them. A massive boom echoed through the chamber, followed by the sound of cracking stone. Dust showered down from above. They've breached the secondary barriers, Nyx said grimly. We have perhaps an hour before they reach this chamber. She placed her hands on Elian's shoulders. We must accelerate your training. She led him to a circular design inlaid in the stone floor near the lake's edge. A complex series of interlocking symbols similar to those on his pendant. Stand in the center, she instructed. When Elian stepped into the circle, the symbols began to glow faintly. Now, Nyx said, I want you to recite the protection phrase I taught you, but this time, focus on pushing your intent through the pendant. Elian closed his eyes, clutching the metal disc in his palm. Shall vectorimer thrasel, he intoned. The pendant grew hot in his hand. The circle beneath his feet flared brilliantly, sending columns of blue light spiraling upward around him. The symbols from the floor seemed to replicate themselves in the air, rotating slowly around Elian like a cage of luminous script. Perfect, Nyx breathed, her eyes reflecting the blue glow. You are indeed his descendant. Whose descendant? Elian asked, voice shaking slightly as the energies swirled around him. Before Nyx could answer, a voice called from the entrance to the chamber. Fascinating display, Keeper, teaching the old ways to a new generation. A tall figure stood in the doorway, a man draped in flowing robes of deepest black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was gaunt, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that gleamed an unnatural crimson. Behind him stood several similarly attired individuals, their features obscured by shadowy hoods. Magistrate Doran, Nyx said coolly, you're trespassing in my personal domain. The man, Doran, smiled thinly. The repository belongs to all seekers of knowledge, does it not? And we seek the greatest knowledge of all. His crimson gaze shifted to Elian, still standing within the circle of light. Ah, so the rumors were true. A child with the bloodline in possession of a Starfare key. Leave now, Nyx commanded, stepping between Elian and the intruders. You have no authority here. Don't I? Doran spread his hands. The Voidwalkers have existed as long as you're kind, Keeper. We've merely been more discreet about our survival. He took a step forward. You know what that pendant leads to. Imagine what we could accomplish with such power, the worlds we could reshape. The worlds you would destroy, Nyx countered. Elian watched this exchange with growing alarm. The protective circle still surrounded him, but he could feel it weakening as his concentration faltered. Boy, Doran called, ignoring Nyx. Do you know what she truly is? Has she shown you her real form? Ask yourself why she lives beside a lake of molten gold in the heart of a mountain. Don't listen to him, Elian, Nyx said sharply. But Elian's eyes were drawn to the golden lake, which had begun to ripple strangely, as if responding to the tension in the room. He noticed now that what he had taken for reflections sometimes showed a massive, scaled form moving beneath the surface. She's deceit incarnate, Doran continued. A relic of an age better forgotten, just like the language she teaches you. Enough, Nyx's voice took on a resonant quality that made the chamber vibrate. Elian, strengthen the ward. Remember the words I taught you. Elian tried to focus, but doubt crept into his mind. What wasn't Nyx telling him? Why did this Doran speak as if they were ancient enemies? Shall vectorimer thrasel, he repeated, but his voice wavered. The circle flickered, dimming momentarily. Doran smiled. Your concentration falters, child. Doubt is the enemy of power. He extended a hand. Come with us instead. We can teach you the true extent of your abilities without lies or half-truths. He offers only destruction, Nyx warned. The Voidwalkers seek the Codex to unmake reality itself, believing they can rebuild it in their image. Bold accusations from one who hides her true nature, Doran replied smoothly. He turned to his followers. Take the boy, be careful not to damage the pendant. The hooded figures moved forward, spreading out to surround the weakening circle of protection. Nyx's posture changed subtly. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an undercurrent of something ancient and terrible. You forget yourself, Doran. This is my domain. The golden lake behind her surged suddenly, waves lapping at the shore as if something massive was rising from its depths. The temperature in the room increased dramatically, and Elian felt sweat bead on his forehead. Elian, Nyx said without turning, I had hoped to prepare you more gradually, but circumstances force my hand. She glanced back at him, and he gasped. Her eyes were no longer violet. They burned a brilliant gold, with vertical pupils that contracted to slits in the brightening light. Whatever you see, remember that I am still your teacher, your protector. What are you? Elian whispered. Doran laughed a cold sound. Show him, Keeper. Show him what manner of creature has been tutoring him. The air around Nyx began to shimmer like a heat mirage. The golden lake bubbled and churned as if in sympathy with her transformation. The Voidwalkers are right about one thing, Elian, she said, her voice growing deeper, more resonant. I am not what I appear to be, but unlike them, I have never lied about my intentions. Before Elian's astonished eyes, Nyx began to change. Her slender form elongated, her elegant robe seeming to melt into her skin, which hardened and gleamed with an opalescent sheen. Her face stretched, features rearranging into something reptilian yet eerily beautiful. Great wings unfurled from her back, spanning half the width of the chamber. Where Keeper Nyx had stood moments before, a magnificent dragon now towered, scales shifting between silver and pale blue, those same golden eyes fixed on Doran and his followers. The lake, Elian realized aloud. It's not gold at all, it's... My horde, the dragon confirmed, her voice now a rumbling thunder that vibrated through Elian's bones. Not of gold, but of knowledge, liquid memories, and wisdom collected across eons. The Voidwalkers had frozen, clearly unprepared for such a direct confrontation with Nyx's true form. Even Doran's confident expression had faltered. Now, the dragon said, you will leave my repository, or you will not leave at all. Doran recovered his composure and raised his hands. Dark energy crackled between his fingers. Then it shall be war between us, as it was in the old days. The protective circle around Elian flared suddenly brighter as his fear and amazement focused his concentration. The pendant at his throat pulsed in rhythm with his racing heart. And as dragon and Voidwalkers prepared to clash, Elian understood with perfect clarity that the true mystery wasn't the ancient language he was learning. It was why this magnificent creature had chosen him, of all people, to learn it. The Guardian's secret. The chamber erupted in chaos as Doran hurled a bolt of crackling darkness toward Nyx's draconic form. She countered with a sweep of her massive tail, sending 3 Voidwalkers flying into the far wall before rearing back and releasing a torrent of blue-white flame that illuminated every corner of the cavern. Elian watched in stunned fascination from within his protective circle. The pendant at his throat vibrated against his skin, growing warmer with each passing second. The dragon who had been his teacher moved with surprising grace for a creature of her size, her scales reflecting the light of her own flames in mesmerizing patterns. Stay within the ward, Nyx commanded, her voice resonating through the chamber as she parried another attack from Doran. The circle will protect you. The Voidwalker magistrate had proved more formidable than his followers. While they struggled to regroup after Nyx's initial assault, Doran stood firm, weaving complex patterns with his hands that sent shadowy tendrils snaking toward the dragon. Where they touched her scales, frost formed, and she hissed in discomfort. Your kind should have perished with the old world, Doran snarled. You're nothing but a remnant, a relic. And yet here I stand, Nyx replied, rearing to her full height. Guardian of knowledge you wouldn't understand how to use. The remaining Voidwalkers circled the combatants, clearly searching for an opening to reach Elian. The boy clutched his pendant tighter, frantically trying to remember the other protective phrases Nyx had taught him. Von Tor Escalith, he whispered, repeating the first phrase he had learned. To his surprise, the words seemed to strengthen the barrier around him. The circle of light pulsed, expanding slightly and growing more opaque. One of the hooded figures lunged toward him, hand outstretched to breach the barrier. As his fingers touched the light, he recoiled with a scream of pain, the fabric of his sleeve smoldering. Elian stared at his hands in wonder. He hadn't simply recited the phrase, he had understood it on a fundamental level. Knowledge is fire, wisdom is how not to burn. The boy learns quickly, Doran observed, momentarily pausing his assault on Nyx. But does he understand what he's protecting? More than you would have him know, Nyx retorted, her golden eyes flashing. Tell him then, Doran challenged. Tell him what the Starfare Codex truly is. Tell him why his ancestors scattered it across the cosmos rather than allow it to remain whole. Nyx lunged forward with startling speed, jaws snapping at Doran, who barely managed to dodge. This is not the time for... It's because they feared their own creation, Doran continued, addressing Elian directly even as he fended off the dragon's attacks. The Codex wasn't just knowledge, it was power beyond imagining, the ability to speak reality into existence, or out of it. Elian's mind reeled. He looked to Nyx, hopping for a denial, but her draconic features remained unreadable. Is that true? He called out, his voice small in the vast chamber. Nyx exhaled a plume of smoke in frustration. It's a simplification, she answered, never taking her eyes off Doran. The Starfare Codex contains the foundational equations of our reality expressed in the old tongue. In the hands of someone with the bloodline, with the proper training, yes, it could reshape worlds. Or unmake them entirely, Doran added. Which is why we seek it. The current reality is flawed, corrupted. With the Codex, we could start anew. At the cost of all existing life, Nyx roared. Elian felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. The pendant seemed to grow heavier against his chest, its significance suddenly terrifying. If what they said was true, then he held the key to unfathomable power and unfathomable destruction. Why me? He whispered, though the words were lost in the ongoing battle. As if sensing his distress, Nyx gathered herself and unleashed a blinding flash of light from her jaws. Doran and his followers shielded their eyes, momentarily disoriented. In that brief respite, she spoke rapidly to Elian. Your lineage traces back to the architects, the creators of the Codex, she explained. Only their bloodline can fully utilize its power. That pendant has been passed down through generations, waiting for the right moment, the right vessel. Her golden eyes fixed on him. I've watched over this repository for 7 millennia, guarding the knowledge within, waiting for someone like you to appear. But I'm just a village orphan, Elian protested. You are far more, Nyx insisted. Look deep within yourself. You can feel the truth of the old tongue when you speak it. That's the bloodline awakening. Before Elian could respond, Doran recovered. With a snarl of rage, he gestured toward the ceiling. Dark energy coalesced above them, then slammed downward in a concentrated beam that struck Nyx between her shoulder blades. The dragon stumbled, her massive form crashing against the shore of the knowledge lake, sending waves of the strange liquid sloshing onto the stone floor. She weakens, Doran told his followers. Take the boy now. The Voidwalkers converged on Elian's protective circle, their hands weaving counter-charms that began to dim its light. The barrier flickered, contracting inward. Elian panicked. He needed more power, more knowledge to strengthen the ward. On instinct, he turned toward the lake of liquid memories. A droplet had splashed near the edge of his circle, if it truly contained knowledge as Nyx claimed. He stretched out his hand, straining to reach the gleaming liquid without leaving the circle's protection. His fingertips brushed the droplet, and immediately his mind exploded with images, sounds, and concepts, snippets of wisdom from countless ages, flowing into him in a torrent that threatened to overwhelm his consciousness. Among the chaotic flood of information, one phrase in the old tongue stood out with crystal clarity. Without thinking, he straightened and spoke it aloud. Kethshar Valontureth. The pendant at his throat flared with blinding intensity. A shockwave of energy burst outward from his position, throwing the attacking Voidwalkers backward and disrupting Doran's concentration. The dark beam tormenting Nyx dissipated, and she rose shakily to her feet, golden eyes wide with astonishment. "That's impossible," she breathed. "That phrase is apex-level Starfire syntax. No novice should be able to—" "His bloodline is stronger than we anticipated," Doran interrupted, regaining his footing. His crimson eyes narrowed. "Perhaps he's not merely a descendant of the architects, but of their inner circle." Nyx's massive head swung toward Elian, studying him with new intensity. "The royal line," she murmured. "It would explain the repository's reaction to him and his natural facility with the language." "Royal line," Elian echoed, still reeling from the knowledge he'd absorbed. "The highest order of the architects," Nyx explained. "Those who crafted the core equations of the Codex itself." She straightened to her full height, renewed purpose evident in her posture. "Which makes protecting you all the more vital." With a roar that shook dust from the distant ceiling, Nyx unleashed her full fury upon the Voidwalkers. Her tail lashed out, sweeping two off their feet. Her jaws snapped, catching another by the robes and tossing him against the wall. Blue-white flame engulfed a fourth. Yet Doran remained unscathed. He moved with unnatural speed, each step leaving a trail of shadow behind him. As Nyx turned to face him directly, he gestured toward the lake of knowledge. "If the boy is what you believe," he said, "then perhaps we don't need him alive. Perhaps just the pendant and a sample of his blood would suffice." Horror crossed Nyx's draconic features. "You wouldn't dare." "Necessity breeds innovation, Guardian." Doran flicked his wrist, and a blade of pure darkness materialized in his hand. "Your precious repository will fall today, and with it, the last barrier between us and the Codex." Nyx prepared to lunge at him, but Doran had positioned himself carefully. Any move she made would leave Elian exposed to the remaining Voidwalkers. Sensing her hesitation, Doran smiled coldly. "How long have you hidden here, Dragon? How many centuries spent in isolation, guarding knowledge that was meant to be used?" "Some knowledge is too dangerous to use," she countered. "All power carries risk," Doran replied. "The difference between us is that you fear it while we embrace it." As they spoke, Elian noticed the protective circle continuing to weaken. The shockwave he'd produced had given them a momentary advantage, but the Voidwalkers were regrouping. He needed to understand more about his connection to this conflict, and quickly. He reached for another droplet of the knowledge lake, bracing himself for the influx of information. This time, he tried to focus his intent, seeking answers about his own past, his connection to the architects. Images flashed through his mind: a towering city of crystalline spires, beings of light discussing equations that hummed with power, a cataclysm tearing reality apart, a desperate plan to scatter fragments of knowledge across the cosmos, and finally a small group fleeing with a child, a pendant clutched in its tiny fist. Elian gasped as the vision ended. "They sent me forward in time," he whispered in realization. "My parents didn't abandon me, they saved me." Nyx's head whipped around, her attention momentarily diverted. "What did you see?" "Enough," Elian replied, a new confidence entering his voice. He placed both hands on his pendant, which thrummed with energy beneath his touch. "I understand what I have to protect now." The circle around him stabilized, then began to expand again, pushing back the approaching Voidwalkers. But as it did, a tremor ran through the chamber, different from the impacts of battle. This came from deeper within the mountain. "What was that?" Elian asked. Nyx's expression darkened. "The repository's defensive systems, they're destabilizing." She shot a venomous glare at Doran. "Your brute force entrance has disrupted the ancient equilibrium if the central archives lose containment." "The knowledge within will be lost," Doran finished, unconcerned. "A small price for what we seek." Another tremor, stronger than the first, shook loose several stalactites from the ceiling. They plunged into the knowledge lake, creating waves that washed dangerously close to the combatants. "You fool," Nyx hissed. "It won't just be lost, it will be released. Unbound knowledge, free to interact with physical reality. Do you have any concept of what that would do?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Doran's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Nix challenged. "You, who claim to seek the Starfare Codex, do you truly understand so little about the nature of information?" A third tremor, violent enough to nearly knock Elian off his feet despite the protective circle. Cracks began to spiderweb across the chamber's floor. "The repository is built on the principles of the Codex itself," Nix continued urgently. "Knowledge contained, directed, purposeful. Break those containers and the raw data becomes chaotic, destructive." Doran hesitated, looking from Nix to the increasingly unstable chamber around them. "She's right," one of his followers called out, panic evident in their voice. "The outer archives are already beginning to destabilize. The texts are changing, merging." "We need to leave," another insisted. "Not without the boy," Doran snapped, though his conviction seemed to waver. Nix turned to Elian, her golden eyes reflecting the urgency of their situation. "The repository is collapsing. Soon, not even I will be able to contain the damage." She lowered her massive head to his level. "I need your help, Elian. Together we might stabilize the systems, but it will require you to embrace your heritage fully." "How?" Elian asked, fighting to stay upright as another tremor rocked the chamber. "The pendant, it's not just a key, it's a focal point, designed to channel the power of the old tongue." Nix glanced at the Voidwalkers, who were now conferring among themselves, clearly concerned about the deteriorating situation. "But to use it properly, you need to trust me completely." Elian hesitated. Hours ago, he had thought himself an ordinary orphan. Now he stood in a collapsing repository of ancient knowledge, faced with a dragon who claimed he was descended from reality's architects, while dark sorcerers sought to capture him for his blood. Yet deep within, something resonated with truth. The old tongue felt right on his lips. The pendant felt like an extension of himself, and Nix, despite her frightening form, had protected him from the moment he'd stumbled into the repository. "I trust you," he said finally. Nix's eyes softened. "Then lower your protective circle and climb onto my back. We must reach the central archive immediately." Elian took a deep breath, then spoke a word to dissolve the barrier. The light faded, leaving him momentarily vulnerable. Before the Voidwalkers could react, he dashed to Nix's side and scrambled up her foreleg to position himself between her shoulder blades. "Hold tight," she instructed, then launched herself toward a tunnel on the far side of the chamber, opposite from where they had entered. Doran shouted in fury behind them, his voice nearly lost in the rumble of another tremor. "This isn't over, Guardian. The boy will fulfill his destiny, with us or with you." Nix paid him no heed, racing through corridors that widened to accommodate her draconic form. Elian clung to the ridges along her spine, the pendant at his throat glowing brighter with each passing second. "What happens now?" he shouted over the noise of their passage. "Now," Nix replied, her voice vibrating through her body beneath him, "we find out if the last heir of the architects can truly speak reality back into balance." They plunged deeper into the repository's heart, leaving the Voidwalkers behind. But not, Elian sensed, for long. Whatever awaited them in the central archive would determine not just their fate, but perhaps the fate of reality itself. And he, a boy who had only wanted to escape bullies, now carried the weight of that responsibility on his small shoulders.